when looking at Jan Moster's painting of the Holy Family, dated around 1550. The vessel here could once more have been modeled after a Raren jug. And seen next to the Baus painting, we can observe that Mostert also juxtaposed stoneware to pewter. This next slide shows a section titled Obesity from Hieronymus Bosch's 7 Deadly Sins, actually painted onto a tabletop in 1408. We can see quite a few people engaged in merriment, especially in drinking to their hearts and content, doing so out of stoneware vessels. Apparently Bosch, born in the Netherlands around 1450, must have been aware of stoneware in his surroundings. One method of explaining, maybe even proving, the Raren origin of the vessels mentioned so far takes the coat of arms into consideration with which stoneware vessels were emblazoned. The arms of Bavaria, Prussia, or Poland, as well as the city arms of Danzig, Hanover, Leipzig, Warsaw, or Amsterdam, to name but a few, have been found on Raren jugs. Obviously, these jugs were manufactured according to orders from the country and cities in question, and not according to the individual potter's fancy. Summing this up, one can say for sure that Raren stoneware was known throughout Central Europe by the late 15th and early 16th century. Another source of information shedding some light on the question of distribution can be found, no, not in written documents, but again on the vessels themselves. There are some jugs bearing the inscriptions of names along with certain professions. For example, the name of Vanquan, Cornelis de Waal, pottery seller in Antwerp, or that of Jan Alters, a ship owner and tradesman from Nimwegen. The jugs tell their own story, whom they were sold to, for whom they were specifically made, and furthermore pointed the means of distribution. In the 16th century, Raren stoneware was even on its way to the British Isles, a fact we can deduce through the help of another kind of vessel, the Mary Rose. This ship had sunk off the coast of England in 1548 and was discovered and salvaged in 1984. Numerous Raren jugs were found among its cargo, quite a few of them located in what one must have been the doctor's quarters. Interesting enough, Raren products were not only on their way around the world, but also used as containers for salves and other kinds of medicine. In this context, I'd like to mention that the pewterware observed in the paintings by Baus and Mostert can be classified as indicators for the lifestyle portrayed. In the 15th and 16th century, pewter was not as common as stoneware. There have not been many findings of antique pewter due to the corrosion of the metal, but one can be sure that pewter that time was more expensive than stoneware. Only massive East Indian imports in the 16th century allowed for greater availability of pewter in households. Together with the jug from vase and crystal painting, we now have two variants from the probably predominant function of Raren stoneware, that of a drinking vessel. The Peasant Marriage by Bruegel, we see here, is the first in a series of paintings by the artist depicting rural scenes. Due to his preference for this genre, Bruegel was also known as Bauernbruegel, or the Bruegel of the peasant. I'm sorry, I can only show you this black and white reproduction. However, one can still clearly make out the various jugs on the tables and in the hands of Bruegel's figure. The jugs, similar to the ones seen before, are pot-bellied and have an indented base. The figures in the foreground are actually drinking from such jars, not out of mud, as one might expect. I've not yet been able to detect the wedding couple, but maybe they have already retired and are at this moment engaged in more informal matters. By the time this scene was painted, the stoneware jug, either as a drinking vessel, a vase, or a container for some kind of substance, had obviously found its way into all kinds of households. That is, if we rule out the possibility that they were solely used on special occasions, such as this village wedding, another painting by Bruegel, dated 1567. The action here seems to be slightly more genteel than the other wedding scenes. The figures are seated at the table, Jacques standing in the corner, ready to replenish the guest's stein. The third and last wedding I would like to draw your attention to, a painting by Peter Barton, shows quite a number of people merrily drinking each other's health, once again doing so with stoneware jugs. Now I ask myself, what are these people drinking? One would of course expect some kind of beer, maybe wine, but it turns out to be milk, judging by the white color of the liquid. White beer, I'm not sure. By the way, the beer tradition of Germany's most famous beer drinking province, Bavaria, begins in 725 with the founding of the Benedictine monastery in Faience Steins. Here we have the world's oldest brewery still existing today. You know that, I'm sure. I would like to conclude the first part of my talk showing various kinds of stoneware examples with Bruegel's pattern dance. The detail here shows a man, the one next to the bagpiper, holding a three-handled jug. We have seen a similar jug in the Metlach collection, and I can show you further examples definitely made in Raren where they were invented. Now, in Bruegel's painting, we have a clue to this peculiar phenomenon. The three handles enable the commune drinker to pass the jug down the line without having to set it on the table in between drinking. In his article Park Cups, a short history, published in the latest edition of Posit, Stephen Smith gives us a detailed survey of these drinking habits. And, interestingly enough, is also concerned with the role of peasant dance in the context. Bruegel now indeed gives us valuable information regarding the customs of this time, more so as he seems to have been quite fond of peasant dance. This favorite pastime, portrayed in painting, also found its way into the ornamental repertoire of the contemporary craftsmen, who began decorating their vase with a dancing and wedding scene, as seen here on one of Jan Eemans mannequin jugs from France. While the painters mentioned above were busy incorporating early stoneware in their painting, the stoneware manufacturers were opening new fields of production, finding new techniques to envision their products. Especially relief techniques allowed for a new and wide scope of decorative possibilities. A prominent position in establishing the importance of Raren stoneware is held by Jan Eemans, who is known to have worked in Raren from 1566 to 1595. Although Eemans' early work was noticeably influenced by Cologne and Siegburg stoneware, he began to develop his own characteristic style around 1570. In the foreground of the frieze on the wedding jug, we see a woman who is asked to dance for the party. In the background, two men can be seen waving to each other. And again, one figure is shown drinking from a stoneware vessel, so to say, a figurative help for the person actually training. In the same year, 1576, Jan Emens decorated some of his jugs with dance scenes. Provided we could see the complete frieze, we could make out two musicians playing dance music for 9 couples, and the lettering on the neck of the jug gives us the names of the dancers in verse. Jan Emens' relief decoration on this and other jugs, however, must be seen in connection with the upcoming print media and subsequently the availability of books and graphic reproductions and their influence on craft in general. The peasant dance Jan Emens portrays, then, is closely linked with a series of copper plates by Hans Behan. Emens actually copied one of these copper plates. Here you can see the copper plate and the details of the jug. In the collection of the Faience Museum in Düsseldorf, there is an unsigned jug from 1583 with 2 oval applications. This one showing the victory of Apollo over Titan, a scene taken out of Greek mythology. Oh, that's difficult to pronounce. Greek mythology. The potter, maybe Emens, copied the wood engraving by Virgil Solis, whose illustrations of these metamorphoses were published in Frankfurt in 1563. In his Metamorphoses, Ovid, who lived from 43, differs slightly from the engraving, where we see the sky and clouds in Solis scenes. The potter has included the facades of houses. The scenes are framed by an inscription, this again following the model. Bearing this in mind, I would like to quote an inscription on one of Jan Emens' jugs. Translated, art always has one enemy, those who either do not understand or do not recognize it. Now, does Emens consider himself as an artist? Is the work of a potter modeled and with a clearly seen orientation towards graphic art? They may be craft or maybe art. In this context, the definitions of art, German Kunst, found in Grimm's dictionary can be of help. Following Grimm, art up to the 16th century is closely related with skill and knowledge, therefore slightly differs from today's perception. Let's look at some work by other potters. At the top of the slide, we see a detail of a jug showing the 4 seasons by Leonard and Johann Krahn, signed 1584. Beneath it, we see the relevant model for this scene, namely the copper plate titled Winter, out of a series by Jacob Floris. The series was made for Hieronymus Koch, a Netherlands publisher, and printed in 1566. The relief application is not reversed, and therefore we can compare model and copy quite closely. Due to the geographic situation of Raren, the potters there seem to have been closer related to Netherlands Flemish publishers than to German ones. Accordingly, it appears that on one hand, while Raren products were being sold abroad, the graphic models for decorating the stoneware were being imported. This consequently leads to the question of who bought and collected these early graphic images. Surely they were not common throughout Europe at this time. Now, where did the potters have to go to see such copper plates and wood engravings? An answer to this question can be deduced from research work done on stoneware production in Siegburg. In 1871, E.B. Dornbusch, a chaplain from Cologne, who was able to collect a multitude of records showing that in Siegburg the local abbey had provided the potters with the necessary graphic material for their work. In Raren, however, there was no abbey, but maybe the Abbey Brandenburg, near Aachen, not far away, allowed the potters from this region to use their library as its fund of new decorative material. So far, no other explanation has been found for that time. This copper plate by Abraham de Brun from 1570, which was copied by many potters for their jugs depicting the life of Susanna, might have also been available in the Abbey's library. I'm afraid I can only show you Susanna's story by Konrad Goldfuss from 1587, but Goldfuss is known to have copied from de Brun. Jan Emmons created quite a few Susanna jugs, but other potters as well have dealt with this topic. In Mettlach, we have a handled jug decorated with 6 scenes from the life of Susanna and made by Edmund Pesch and Engel Kahn in 1584. Here we have the following inscription: Didis Dei Historia van Susanna in Corte Altgesneiden, anno 1584. Translated, it means this is the story of Susanna, and in Corte Altgesneiden refers to the fact that the potters themselves cut the mold used for the application. De Brun and Goldfuss both followed biblical tradition very closely in their portrayal of Susanna, and so did Pesch and Kahn. In the first scene, am I allowed now? You know, I want to compare copper plate and what you can see on the sleeve of the jug. So, oh, that's great, fine. So I have my paper and I can fine. In the first scene, according to the Old Testament, Book of Daniel, Psalm 13, 2 judges in Babylon decide to spy on Susanna while taking a bath in her garden. Here is the first scene of the jug. Second scene, as soon as Susanna is alone, they step forward and demand that Susanna submit to their will. Otherwise, they would tell her husband Susanna had betrayed him and committed adultery. Third scene, Susanna, however, does not succumb to their wishes and is sentenced to death after the 2 villains have perjured themselves. Daniel, the fourth of the great prophet, hears God's voice and can arrange for another questioning of the 2 judges. Daniel then asks the 2 separately beneath which tree they had observed Susanna's adulterous action. The first answers beneath an oak tree, the second beneath a lime tree. This contradiction leads to a new trial, and in the 6th scene, the perjurers are sentenced to hard labor. Another example is by Peter Emon and dated 1584. The 6 scenes on the jug are accompanied by an inscription which reads: Didis der Historia Susanna war wahrlich belachend, wann zwei Altwörter ihres Gedos. Roughly translated, this would read: This is the story of Susan, falsely accused by 2 old men. The potters, however, did not solely turn to biblical or mythological material for their work. They also used ornamental patterns, seen on this slide. These patterns, here in the middle, were actually intended for goldsmiths when working with gems, pearls, and precious matter. These prints by Johann Koller, published in Antwerp in 1581, however, found their way into the hands of stoneware manufacturers and subsequently onto the medals of such Raren jars as seen here. The difference between such substances as gold and silver and the somewhat rougher material clay accounts for the loss of some of the intricate correctures seen in the pattern. Still, the relation between the ornaments on the jars and patterns can be traced. Raren stoneware on paintings and graphic arts for stoneware. As we've seen, artists such as Christus, Baus, and Mostert incorporated Raren stoneware in their religious paintings as early as the 15th century. Accordingly, we can assume that Raren stoneware was known and esteemed at this time. While Baus and Mostert set stoneware next to pewter objects, maybe to emphasize certain lifestyles, we find a great many Raren objects in genre paintings of Reusel and Balsen. In addition, these painters show the variety of stoneware known at this stage. This method of research allows us to find answers to questions concerning distribution and usage of the stoneware in the 15th and 16th century without necessarily looking towards written material for help. On the other hand, the decoration of stoneware objects was greatly influenced by contemporary graphic art. Copper plates and wood engravings served as models for relief applications, opening various thematic fields: rural scenes, biblical motifs, stories taken from ancient history, as well as from mythology. In addition, we have the predominantly ornamentative influence of goldsmith patterns. The relationship between model and application can be clearly made out. There is, however, one example which I do not want to hold back. I will conclude the examples of stoneware adaptations of copper plates with this magnificent vessel made by Jan Emens in 1587. Today is a collection of the Kunstgewerbemuseum in Cologne. Applied to otherwise smooth necks with clear lines marked, the frieze then show the life of Joseph the Egyptian according to Moses. Joseph's father, Jacob, also known as Israel, loved his youngest born dearly. The other children, however, hated him. These details show how closely Emens followed the Bible in his adaptation. She succeeds in slandering Joseph, who is sentenced to prison. In prison, Joseph reads the dreams of his fellow prisoners, who turn out to be employees of the Pharaoh, who learns of this strange man. In a dream, the Pharaoh sees 7 emaciated cows devouring 7 fat ones. Here we see Joseph reading the Pharaoh's dream. He advises the Pharaoh to build large barns and therein store the harvest of 7 rich years for the coming 7 lean years. The Pharaoh follows Joseph's advice. When the famine sets in, Joseph's brother hear of the provisions in Egypt and set out for his country. Seen here is Joseph, by now a high official in Egypt, acknowledging and forgiving his brother. Joseph's father, accompanied by all the remaining family, then traveled to Egypt on a wagon the Pharaoh had sent to them. In the foreground, Joseph is being blessed by the Pharaoh. When Jacob died, Joseph asked the Pharaoh to allow him to bring the inscription on the vessel reads, "The history from Joseph is named outward." You might have noticed that although describing the frieze in detail, I've not shown you the appropriate copperplate this piece might have been copied from. Well, the thing is, on one hand, we do know that Eamon adapted this piece. On the other hand, however, we do not know which copperplate he might have used to do this. And I consider it one of my goals, maybe also the goal of other interested in stoneware, to find out the influences that allowed Eamon to create this masterpiece. Should the source of the application, however, have been lost throughout the ages, then Eamon's jug stands out as a reminder, an image of the lost piece of art. Thank you very much for your attention, especially thanks to Dr. Tamar for her guidance and to Mrs. Berg for her kind assistance in handling the slides. Thank you.
East of Los Angeles, running just east of the San Andreas Fault. Okay. It's right there. I live about 8,000 feet up in the mountains. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. No, back up one. And I do not live in a cave. I live in a house, and this is it. And so, tonight, or this afternoon, we're speaking of Franz Ringer. I did an article in Prosit on Franz Ringer about a year and a half, 2 years ago. And since then, I wondered, why did I write this article? Because since then, the prices of the Steins have almost tripled. So I kind of kicked myself in the pants there. I started collecting Ringer Stein, or Steins, stoneware Steins like this back in the early 70s. I noticed signatures and things like that, but I didn't pay much attention to them. After I got about 6 of these Steins, they all had the same signature, and they had a lot of the same traits. So I started asking, does anybody know who this signature of FR is? And I went nowhere, absolutely nowhere. Finally, Lottie Lopez came up with the name, and it was Franz Ringer. But who was Franz Ringer? I looked him up in the dictionaries for artists, and all it says is Franz Ringer, artist, the day he was born and the day that he died. And unfortunately, they had the wrong day that he died, which I found out later. In the meantime, I kept finding and purchasing more and more of these Steins. I started noticing similar traits, a very unique style, but who was Franz Ringer? I came across the book with Making Steins in an Old Monastery by Thielen, and he wrote it in 1909. And pictured in it is a Stein, and it is attributed to Franz Ringer of Munich. So now that I knew he had designed Steins for Villeray and Bach, I asked my friend and art scholar, Teresa Thomas, who, have she ever heard of Franz Ringer? And she says, yes, she had heard of him. And give her some time, and she'll see what she can find out. Well, with the help of Beatrice Adler, Teresa came up with some documents that they Xeroxed and forwarded to me. and it started my 6-year quest on who is Ron's ringer. And it'll probably take me another 6 years until I'm really, really sure about who he really is. Next slide, please. The more I read of Ron's ringer, I found out things that he did besides Steins. He did posters and postcards. Next slide, please. There's another postcard that he did for New Year. Next slide, please. He did, again, these photos were taken off of Xerox copies, so excuse the quality of them. But he did baskets, schnapps bottles. Next slide, please. Candlesticks, glass plates. Next slide, please. Light fixtures in metal. Next slide. Book illustrations. Here we have Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and Hansel and Gretel. Next slide, please. He did furniture. Next slide. Next slide, please. He did the hardware that went on the outside of the furniture. Next slide. He designed building facades. All this are things that he did, and the whole outside is decorated with his work. Next slide, please. He did the interiors of the rooms. Next slide. This is another interior that he did. These are the original designs, and then they were wooden cutouts that were placed against the wall. Next slide, please. He did signs for the outside of restaurants. Next, please. He did tile mosaics. Next slide, please. This is another tile mosaic. Next slide, please. He designed wagons. Next slide. Smoking sets. And again, candlestick holders. Next slide, please. Sun clocks for the outside of buildings. Your numbers went along there, and a stick came out, and as the shadow fell, it told you what time it was. Next slide, please. These are maypole figurines for when they had their maypoles. These decorated them. Next slide, please. And these are, of course, designs for beer steins. Yay. Born October 7th of 1865, he was the son and grandson of master carpenters in Munich. At a young age, he started his apprenticeship in carpentry. The skills that he acquired during this time served him well throughout his creative life. Many of his works in wood are still in existence, and you can find them around Bavaria and Munich especially, and they come up in auctions now and then. At the age of 20, Ringer went on an extended journey through the Tyrol and Switzerland. During this time, there's not any information on what he did or what he studied. But upon his return to Munich, he began to study under Professor Joseph von Kramer. But again, the urge to travel soon took Ringer north to the city of Aachen. In Aachen, he studied under Professor Karl Kraus at the Polytechnic Institute. While in northern Germany, Ringer visited the Netherlands, where he developed a great liking for the people and their styles. He would often depict these people and their manner of dress in many of his works. Next slide, please. Here are some of the designs of people in the style of the Netherlands. Next, please. And again, we see the distinct style here. He's smoking a clay pipe that was very distinctive for the Netherlands. When he returned to Munich again, he again studied under his mentor, Professor Kramer. Professor Kramer had the greatest influence in Ringer's style. Ringer's oldest independent works are from this period, which is 1892 to 1894. They are small plaster of Paris relief scenes of everyday people. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Again, these are all the plaster of Paris relief things. And next slide, please. And this is one from my collection. It's very, very fragile. It's about 4.5 inches wide by 10 inches high. And it's very, very distinctive of Ringer's work. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. Franz Ringer, almost all of his works are signed, but when they're not, there's certain distinct things to look for. He drew hands in a very unique way. The middle two fingers are 98% of the time they're together with the index and the little finger pointed out. There's a very good example here, and again on her hand here. Here's the fingers, the two together, and the spread one. He also drew shoes, very simple shoes always. He never went very ornate in the shoes. Okay, next one more, Matt. He also liked to surround the subject with a border or a wreath. Next slide, please. Excuse me, just another example of the hands. We see the child here with the two middle fingers together and the little finger and the index finger out. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, he loved to surround his figures with a cartouche or a wreath of some kind. Next slide, please. Again, we see different sorts of frames for his scenes. In my article in Prosit, I mentioned manufacturers which produced the Steins that Ringer designed. I made an error at that time. I just looked at the bottom of the Steins and presumed that they manufactured the fully decorated Stein. I've since learned that the majority of these Steins were in fact designed by the enhancement factories in Munich, such as Martin Paulsen, Bruno Tannhauser, Riedemann, Lichtiger. What they would do, they'd buy the blank bodies and decorate them themselves in Munich. Next slide, please. Okay, this is when the documents have helped out a lot. Here it says Stoneware Stein from the designs of Franz Ringer for Martin Paulsen. These were all put out by the Martin Paulsen Company of Munich. And over here it says the Franz Ringer designs for Riedemann and Lichtiger. And again, I'm sure they bought the blank bodies and decorated them in Munich. Next slide, please. These Steins here are also for Paulsen, and I believe Bruno Tannhauser, and they were all done in pewter. After the transfer was applied, they were enameled and just touched up real nice. Next slide, please. Here are two Steins of the same transfer. One's a 1 liter and one's a ½ liter. But when you start looking at the detail, you start noticing a lot of different things. It's hard to see in here, but the woman here and the woman here, she has a polka dot dress on hers, solid. Next Stein, please. Slide, please. The gentleman here has 3 buttons. He only has 2. And this gentleman here, who is buying a beer from the barmaid, over here there's no barmaid or no Steins. It's just when they touched it up and they were enhancing the Stein, that was left out. And of course they both bear the signature FR. Franz Ringer was very much involved in civic and national events. His designs were often chosen as the official emblem for these events. Because the Steins, the Steins for these official events always had a date on them, and that helps us a great deal when we're trying to figure out just what years he did his greatest and his most prolific work. Next slide, please. The earliest Stein that I have found that is dated is the one on the left, and it was from 1903. It's from the 15th, it's from the 44th Grand Assembly of the Society of German Engineers in Munich. Again, it's dated 1903. All the paperwork I've found says he didn't start designing Steins until about 1900. So this fits right in. And it's one of the few Steins you'll ever find where he doesn't have a border or a cartouche of some kind around his subject. The center Stein is from the Deutsch, I'm lost again here. It's from a Master Brewers Convention of 1909. And the one on the right is from the 8 Deutsches Sanger Bundesfest in Nuremberg of July 27th, 31st, 1912. Next slide, please. These Stein, the Stein here on the left is from the there goes my German again, Deutsches Bundeshessen of 1906. Likewise is the middle Stein, and then the one on the right is from the Hamburg Deutsches Bundeshessen. Jack, am I saying that right? Okay, close enough. Shooting Festival of 1909. The Steins, the Stein on the right and the Stein in the middle are from the same event, although they're very different. Next slide, please. Okay, here they are again. They're both from the 1906 Deutsches Shooting Festival. But the difference is, it seems that Ringer would submit several designs to the companies, and they would decide which one would be the official fest crew. Next slide, please. It says here, official fest crew, and then the names in Bruder, Tannhauser, Munich. And this one just bears the mark of Bruder, Tannhauser, Munich. So the one on the right was sold as the official Stein, and then these were just sold if you like them better. Next slide, please. These are a couple more commemorative Steins that he did. The one on the left is for the Deutsches Turnfest of 1908 in Frankfurt. And the one on the right is from the Deutsches Turnfest of 1912 in Leipzig. 1913, thank you. Next slide, please. These are different variations of the same decoration on smallest Stein, ceramic beaker, glass beaker, and again the stoneware Stein. And they all are marked with official beaker, and official fest crew. Next slide, please. And they were evidently sponsored by Snellenberg's Kaiser magazine in Frankfurt. So I guess back at the turn of the century, they also had official sponsors for their athletic events, much as we have. Next slide, please. These are some of the Steins that Franz Ringer designed for the Villeray and Bach Company. Again, we see the cartouche or the wreath around it. Next slide, please. This is one of the few Steins you see that he decorated that the design actually goes almost all the way around the Stein. His style was somewhat hard to describe. Some people call him a Jugendstil artist, which he wasn't. And he really was a little bit late for the Biedermeier period, so we call, Professor Schmall gave me the name New Biedermeier. Again, the people are dressed in very Dutch costumes, but Stein has the shape of the Jugendstil period, so it's kind of a contradiction in itself. Next slide, please. Next slide. Again, these are all from the Villeray and Bach. These are all in the 3000 series. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. This is the largest Stein that I've found that he worked on. It holds 4.2 liters. Next slide, please. And these are also from Villeray and Bach. Again, the nice lines in the shape, but the gentleman and the lady on the end are dressed extremely Biedermeier, and we have a Jugendstil shaped Stein. So again, he was a contradiction in himself. Of these Steins, there are 2 in blue, 2 in red, and 2 in yellow. I've only been able to purchase these 3, so if anyone has them out there, give me a call. Next slide, please. This is a copy of Ringer's death certificate. It states that he died on December 1st of 1917. He died of cancer. This is the first evidence we found of his true date of death. His death is often mistaken for that of his son, his only son, who died a year later in World War I. And I have to again thank Teresa Thomas and Beatrice Adler for coming up with this for me. Next slide, please. This is one of the obituaries that ran. It has fellow artists, friends, and acquaintances, came to the event, in the Waldfriedhof. I hope it's whatever it is. My German's not that great. Where this well-known and much-loved artist and sculptor, Franz Ringer, would put to eternal rest many leaves and flowers, appreciate eulogy. Next slide, please. Again, here is another remembrance of the death of Franz Ringer. Let me get my notes here. I can just read it off there. Remembrance of Franz Ringer, who died in his prime of cancer. Ringer was a painter and sculptor and very much involved with arts and crafts. His original designs are found on hundreds of Munich beer steins, target discs, and delightful figurines, small figures full of humor and good cheer. Founding the German, there goes out of focus. Can you focus, please? There. Get it down here. Founding the German Museum required putting Munich in festive robes, which he did to his very best. Many tavern and hotel interiors, the designing of maypoles, but many tableaux, just before the outbreak of World War I. He was a great festival organizer, decorated for Fasching, Salvatore time, and he gave sharp-tongued talks, all in fun, in order to get the festivities off to a good start. Next slide, please. And this appeared what would have been Franz Ringer's 70th birthday, and as Franz Ringer, still unforgotten in this city, would have been 70 years old today. He died on December 1st, 1917, after a life full of work in his 53rd year. His widow had decorated his grave with many flowers. Ringer is especially well known as an arts and craft person. His original figurines, mostly in Biedermeier style, on glasses for everyday use, this may be beer steins also. He is a glass painter, or designs executed in wood, were very much admired or being imitated at this time again. He designed the Schaffler dancers in the Glockenspiel, together with sculptor Fry. Also humorous characters in the old-time Munich in the Ratskeller. The old-time figures in the Ratskeller are no longer there. We figured they were lost sometime during World War II. Ringer was always involved with congresses, festive parades, such as the founding and laying of the Deutsches Museum, or in many other city-sponsored festivities. With his friend, Professor Jacob Bradel, Ringer played parts in several plays. He also did some frescoes, such as on the estate Holsten in the Isar Valley. His only son, who served in the elite regiment, fell in September of 1918 and is buried in France. Okay, next slide, please. This is the Hotel Bayerischer Hof in Immenstadt, as it looked at the turn of the century. Again, all the little cartouches here have Franz Ringer design figures in them. The outside is painted. Next slide. This is the Bayerischer Hof today, and all the paintings are gone. Next slide, please. You can see the difference. In Ringer's 125th year, this has been his 125th birthday this year, it's a shame that more of his work doesn't still exist, although I'm finding out more and more places to look. Next slide, please. When we first started looking, we went through the Munich phone book, and these are all the Ringers listed in the Munich phone book. Letters to them all didn't help us out at all. We had one person respond that said, yes, he had heard of Franz Ringer, but no, he is not a relative. Next slide, please. Again, Ringer designed steins that were great and small. Next slide, please. He designed in pewter. Next. He designed in stoneware. Next. And he designed in glass, or for glass, I should say. Next slide. He designed in the style of the Faience. Next. Jugendstil. Next. Biedermeier. Next. And he even designed characters. The character steins were produced by Reinemann. They have no signatures, but they all bear the Ringer look. When the hands are closed, The two middle fingers again are slightly different from the outside, and you'll find it on ringer hands all over. On ringer has eyes that look away all the time. They never seem to look right at you. They're always looking off. When ringer drew steins, the sides of the steins always rounded out. They were never straight-sided steins. Next slide, please. Here again we have some more early drawings, designs by ringer. Next. And here they are again. Here's the original design, and here where it appears in the hotel. Next. We're going to look at some pieces by ringer now. This is one of his glass plates. It's a transfer, and the back side of the plate is hand painted to bring out the colors. Next. There's a whole series of these. I've got 9 of them now, and they all have numbers on them. My lowest number I think is 6. My highest number is 63. So I don't know how many steins are in between. Next, please. These are little tiny steins. The steins on the outside are approximately 2 1/4 inches high. They're for children. Next time, please. Designed for beakers, and many times you'll find the same design on a beaker that you'll find on a stoneware stein, so the transfer is just interchangeable. Next, please. These are watercolors. Of course, they're in black and white, but next, please. Another glass purple. Next, please. Some of the glass steins that he produced. Next, please. Next. These are glass with pewter rims, and much like stained glass, only they're getting the transfers for the outline. In the back of the glass is hand colored. Oh, the one in the middle is 4 inches wide and 12 1/2 inches tall. And the other ones are approximately 4 by 8. Next slide, please. These are 2 unsigned ringer pieces, but when I was doing the research, I found photos of both in catalogs, so I was able to confirm that they were Franz Ringer. And they have the distinctive zoom wall thumb lift that I've only found on his pieces. Next piece. Some steins from Munich, at Grußhaus Munich, and 2 steins from the Hofbräuhaus. Next slide, please. This is one of the few times you'll see the fingers not the way they normally are. And it's a man with a mask over his mouth, and it says, "Ich sage nicht mehr," I say no more. Yes, it's signed in the rear. Next, please. Some more steins, one for the German-Austrian alliance, a Schützenfest stein, and just a regular old guy drinking a beer. Next, please. This is my favorite stein, and I'll just show this one side. It breaks down to, I always love myself a cool, fresh beer. Next, please. Okay, that's the last slide. Now with Franz Ringer, he was a man who didn't fit any one mold. He designed in all styles, and from what we've read, Ringer was involved in many civic events. Again, his steins were used for many official city and state events. He designed several official steins for the Oktoberfest. For the Oktoberfest 100-year anniversary, there's 3 different versions of it. Again, I wish I knew Franz Ringer. I like to think that every time we talk of Ringer or look at his steins, that wherever he is, he realizes that his work was appreciated. He doesn't get the notoriety notoriety of the Schlitz, or the Raymer Schmitz, but in his own right, he was every bit as creative. I wish I would have known Franz Ringer. I think I would have liked him for his activities. He seemed to be involved in everything. And if anybody has any questions on Franz Ringer, I'll always, feel free to ask me. I know a lot, but there's so much more I don't know. So if I've missed anything, also come tell me, because we're all learning. And are there any questions? Yes, Pat.
While you were talking about the numbers, the stone wall, I noticed that some of them have somewhat of a hole right in the middle. Are those things work also?
You see it quite a bit. Franz Ringer designed a lot of his own pewter. And living in Munich and working with the enhancement factories, he had an advantage over having the lids put on up in the Westphal. I have noticed it a lot. You'll see some of the round thumb lists, but they're oval, and those are not Ringer. I've found that they are not Ringer. But again, the finishing enhancement factories could use them for anything they wanted. But yes, it's a distinct Ringer sign, but it doesn't always make it a Ringer. Any other questions? Terry. I don't know. My next trip is to spend some time in Bavaria and follow the leads that I have. Hopefully I'll be able to find more information on Franz Ringer and his works. It's so frustrating that with all the great artists of Germany, that so much is lost during the two world wars, and we may never get to see a lot of their work, only in pictures and catalogs. It's like in the Rathskeller, when they redid the Schlitt paintings, they didn't do them exactly the way they were originally drawn. And we found this out through old postcards and whatnot. Franz Ringer, I can go into a paper store where they sell postcards and whatnot and ask for Schlitt cards, and they'll say yes or no. And I ask for Franz Ringer cards, and they go, "Who is that?" And to me, he was one of the greatest artists of his time for the folk work, the arts and crafts. And like I said in one of the articles, that in the 40s, right after World War II, they're starting to execute his designs again in Steins. So his style carried over a while. It's also a shame that his only son died in World War I, and his wife never remarried because we lost all contact with any family. When Teresa did the talk on Otto Hoop, she was lucky enough to have found his daughter, and his daughter had a ton of information and drawings and pieces of his artwork. But again, with Franz Ringer, we really came against a dead end, and we're still going to be looking. And I know Professor Small worked for years on Heinrich Schlitt and eventually found some great information. Hopefully we'll get some more on Franz Ringer. His Steins are becoming extremely popular. And you can all stop buying them now, okay? So what can I say? He's my favorite artist, and I loved his work before I knew who he was. Thank you. I think if you wait here, Teresa Thomas has something to say about his Schlitt exhibit before we go over there. So.